Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In our previous lecture, we discussed the notion of the narrative voice, the narrator, or the point of view in novels and short stories. We looked at this aspect of style in literary writings, that how a writer creates a personality, a persona, a character, or a speaker who narrates the story. And apart from creating the characters, the plot, the story, the situation, the incidents, a writer pays attention to the fact that how the story is to be told, who is to narrate the events, from whose perspective, from whose angle, point of view or experience the narrative is to be told. Either it has to be a character within the story who undergoes an experience and narrates that experience as a participant as well as the observer of the situation. In other cases, there can be a speaker who is an all-knowing and an understanding and encompassing figure like that of the author, who narrates the events being an outsider from the perspective, from the story, or from the events in the story. Now, this perspective is that of the omniscient narrator, who may choose to be an intruder as well, who may choose to be a person who is giving advice or directions to the reader to interpret or read the story in a particular way. So there are options available to the writers when they are writing fiction or novels and short stories, to choose the narrative from the perspective of a character, or to choose to present the narrative from the perspective of some outsider who is either omniscient narrator or who is an intrusive omniscient narrator too. Now, when it comes to the case of poetry, how are we to locate the speaker? How are we supposed to find out from whose perspective the story or the poem is being told? Now, in case of fiction, it is simple to determine, because fiction gives room to characters, dialogues, and descriptions which appear to be more like a conversation taking place in daily life, where we don't have much difficulty in identifying who the speaker is, from whose angle the story is being told. But when it comes to poetry, we must keep in mind that poetry too makes use of a narrator the way any fiction or in the form of novel or story would make use of. But how to locate that speaker in a poem, how to associate that person either with the poet or with the character within the story, is a complicated thing which we have to pay a little more minute attention to. Let us look today on the idea of perspective, speaker, persona in poetry. Now, this too would be referred to as the narrative voice in poetry. Poetry also makes use of narrators and speakers the way any novel or fiction would make use of. And poets have the potential to tell stories as much as any novelist or a short story writer has the potential to narrate a story. A narrative consists of the sequence of events that recount a story, which is the central aspect of narrative poetry. Now, first we will have a look at the specific type or kind of poetry that is referred to as narrative poetry. Then we will look at some other kinds to know and to locate the speaker or the voice within poetry. Now, narrative poetry, as the very title suggests, is a poem that tells a story, that describes events and tells stories. You can include in narrative poetry any type of poem that is an epic or a ballad. Now, understanding the narrative voice in any poem involves following the understanding of the situation, the plot, or the happening within the poem, and analyzing who the speaker is. So, when we are to know a speaker in the poem, when we are to locate the narrative voice in a poem, we must first find out where the action is taking place and who is describing that action. Now, it will be clear through our minute understanding and reading or close reading of the text, of course. Now, considering all these aspects, for example, locating the narrator and also pointing out to the incident happening in the poem and the location or the setting of the poem. These will help us in finding out the narrator, his perspective, his point of view, his position, his stance, his opinions, and of course his personality too. Now, considering all aspects of the narrator helps readers understand how the poet sketches characters within the confines of poetic style. Now, poetry too makes use of the creation of characters. We are not supposed to all the time limit or confine the views given in the poem to the poet himself. Just the way the novel gives a room to the writer that he can efface his personality behind the characters or the persona or the narrator. Similarly, in poetry also, writers hide themselves or they kind of efface themselves behind the character, the speaker, or the persona within the poem. So, within the style of poetry, which we may assume might be more subjective than personal account, is also a room for a speaker to impress us, to influence us in the same way, the way a speaker or a persona or the narrator in the novel or short story does. Now first, let us have a look at the narrative poems and see how the narrative voice in the narrative poetry affects the reader, or how can it be located or identified in narrative poetry. Narrative poems, as the very title suggests, are those poems which tell stories, which describe events, which describe happenings, incidents that might be historical events, personal events, or these events might also have political and social connections as well. Narrative poems are those poems that have a plot, that have an action. Certain poetic styles, such as epics and ballads, traditionally feature a story. Now, which are the poems which as a kind of poem we can locate or identify with narrative poetry? There are two major or basic types of poems, epics and ballads, which we call the narrative poems or narrative poetry. Now, if we look at both these types separately, we find that there are certain differences between both the types, despite the fact that epics and ballads both are narrative poems. But the difference between the two is that epics have been distinguished from the ballads on the basis of their elevated language, their elevated themes, and diction as well. Now, when epics make use of very dignified, elevated language, they differentiate themselves from the ballads, which on the contrary make use of very colloquial, or you can say simple style of presentation of poem. Epics are concerned mostly with the noble people. They describe the lives, the event, and the life, the events of the more elite or superior people, whereas the ballads deal with the subject matter that is connected to the life of the peasants or the common people or the countryside folks. Now, when these two types of narrative poems differ in the handling of the subject matter, as one confines itself to the dignified, elevated, and more superior class of the nobles like kings, queens, warriors, and knights, and the ballads confine themselves to the common folk, the country folk. We see that in epics, which are more lengthy. Epics comprise of thousands of lines, and they comprise of many books and parts as well. So epics are long poems that describe the actions of a heroic character. Now, the characters in the epics are not common people as found in the ballads. Usually, epics contain a story that spans over a longer period of time, delineating the problems, the adventures, and the accomplishments of a hero. That might be a king, a warrior, a knight. And this is where we see that epics differ from the ballads, because ballads are narrative songs which traditionally follow the format of rhymed quatrains. and ballads usually follow the lyrical pattern as well, and these are 4 quatrains or the 4-line stanzas. Ballads usually are about anonymous folks. They might not be about very well-known, dignified or elite people. They are about anonymous country folk, and they recount the centralized dramatic events of their life, such as a man's labor beating the machines, or the story of unrequited love, or the story of suffering, or even loneliness and death. So narrative poetry spans far back as the epics of the classical time like Homer and Virgil, and we find in it antiquity through medieval ballads, from the medieval ballads to the more modern poems. Now in the narrative poems of these kinds, that is the ballad and the epic, we find the third person account or the narrative, that we find the author or the writer, that is the poet, creating the account that is being told in the third person, as a character being referred to as he, who undergoes adventures, experiences, and maybe comes across difficulties or hardships, or even faces troubles in life. Now the epic's narrative perspective is from the perspective of the poet, who tells the story in the third person. So mostly epics and ballads follow this format, where the speaker is telling us the story of a third person whom he knows well, about whose life he has collected all the details, as he the author or as the poet has got hold of all the knowledge about the person, either his adventures in the physical plane as well as his state of mind or psychology too. So an all-knowing narrator tells about the hero as the third person, narrating that tale or his adventures about his life. Now that we have looked at the narrative poetry, or the 2 kinds of narrative poetry, that is ballad and epic, that tell the story or the events of life of a character, we look at the speaker generally in the other forms of poems too. With the help of a few examples, we will be analyzing how in different poems by different poets, a particular sort of a speaker is created who addresses the readers, or who speaks to the reader. Either it's a character within the poem, or either it is the poet himself, or it is the persona whom we cannot really identify either with the poet or with any character within the poem. In poetry also, the narrator tells the story, and he gives the speaker a voice, and we find 3 types of speaker. Commonly they are found in the style of the poetry, either narrative or dramatic. With one, the speaker participates in the story, and perhaps as the main character. So one way to narrate a story in poetry is that making the speaker a character within the poem. Now this speaker is the participant within the poem, and from whose perspective we look at the story, or who is describing to us what has happened in his life. Conversely, the narrator might not participate, but is present at the time as he tells what he observes. Now, in some other cases, unlike the first case where the speaker is the participant who has undergone an experience, and he tells about that experience directly to the reader, being the character within the poem. Now there might be another possibility that the speaker might be the observer but not the participant. So in this we find a difference between a participant speaking through the poem to the reader, who is a character within the story in the poem, and the other case is that of a speaker who knows the events, who tells the events, but is not a participant or a main character, but an observer, an outsider. Then third case is that the speaker may be completely outside the story. He is not either the participant, nor is he the observer, but he is just a voice describing things from a distance. So these are the 3 cases available in the poetry, where we can locate these three types of narrators. The first narrator is the character, directly telling us what he has been through, recollecting the experience, his emotions as well as his experiences. Second is the case of a participant who is rather present at that time when some incident happened that he is describing, but he is not involved directly in that incident or sort of a situation. So he has been there, but as observer of the situation or incident, not as the participant of the situation. For example, if as a friend in a poem somebody tells us about some incident or experiences that he had seen or observed, or as a passerby or a bystander, then the last case is that of a speaker who doesn't seem to be either the participant of the story or the observer of the story, but he is located outside that incident or story, whom we associate mostly with the poet, that he has knowledge of that incident, but neither had he been a participant nor had he been the direct observer or present at that very moment when the situation had occurred or the incident had happened. Now that we know the three types of narrators in poetry, just the way we had a look at the three types of narrators in fiction. Now, the case of fiction was more complicated, because when we located these three types of narrators in the fiction, we found further sort of kinds within those, three kinds. That either if we identify the speaker in fiction as omniscient narrator, we find that omniscient narrator can be intrusive and unintrusive both. When we located the first person narrator, we said that first person can be reliable and unreliable as well. At the same time, he can also be neurotic too. So there were differences within that kind, or there were further types within a single kind in fiction. But the case of poetry is a little simpler, as you find that the narrators have three types. One is the speaker, who is the character, one is the speaker who is the observer, and thirdly the speaker who is the observer but not present at that moment when it had directly happened in the life of a few other characters. Now let us look at the different different aspects of narration in poetry. Firstly, the narration in poetry, or the narrator in poetry, has got different point of view, the angle, the perspective, the opinion. Narrators speaking of their own actions usually used first person pronoun, that is I. So if the speaker is the character within the poem would be used with the or the poem would be told from the perspective of I, the first person pronoun. We will look at the examples also to identify in which poems a direct participant or a character as the speaker emerges. Second is the third person narrator, who tells a story that happened to others, just the way it is in fiction, that a writer telling us about some character who he has seen, observed, and he talks about. So if these narrators have no insight into the thoughts of the participants, their point of view is objective. Now that we see the first type of the third person narrative, in which if the narrator does not give insight into the soul, the psyche, or the mind of a character, we say that their point of view is objective. Objective in the sense that they are not biased, or they are not giving a personal account of their understanding, belief, and view about some person. So this third person persona, who tells about somebody else, but objectively not giving us insight into his soul, his mind, the mechanism of the a mental state of the character, his opinion will be considered to be more objective. Then in poetry, if we have the omniscient narrator, who is kind of god-like figure, the way it had been in fiction, that he has the knowledge of the characters, their actions, and also he knows their inner state of mind, their thoughts as well. So such a speaker or such a narrator who has the knowledge of the actions of a character or the persona in the poem, as well as his state of mind, that is considered to be the omniscient narrator in poem, or the godlike narrator who has knowledge of everything that is being described. Now let us analyze or look at the way to analyze poetry with respect to its speaker or the voice within poetry. Understanding of the narrative voice in poetry requires minute and detailed analysis of the way a poet has created and designed a poem. Readers start usually by considering who the speaker is, whether it's the poet or it's some specific persona, or is it some omniscient being. Now these are three instances which we can look for, or the three types of speakers that we can look for in any poem. Firstly, we may look at it from the perspective whether the speaker is himself or herself a character within the poem, or is it a persona that is observer of the events, or is it an all-knowing omniscient narrator or speaker who, like the poet, is looking at the events, commenting on the events, and even revealing the details of a kind which reveal the workings of the mind as well as the a soul. Now, in the way we identify the speaker or the voice in poetry, we also look at the setting. Now, in order to locate the speaker or to identify from whose point of view or perspective the story is told, we observe the setting or the situation. Without observing the setting, the plot, the situation in a poem, it's not possible to locate or identify the speaker. Now, when we identify where the action happens and whether it occurs during a specific time period, in a historical moment, or literary time period, offer insight into the mechanism or of the characters' thoughts, as well as it reveals the poem's overall meaning. So, as a reader or as an analyst, you must consider whether the poem belongs to a specific era or time period, and you should follow the storyline in order to locate where did it occur or when did it occur. So when you know about the when and where of the story or the poem, you'll be better able to understand the speaker's motives, his feelings, his point of view. Then in narrative poetry, we see that it builds up the story or the action by creating tension that leads to conflict. So poems like epics and ballads, if they are considered to be narrative poems because on the account of the fact that they narrate events, accidents, incidents, happenings, hardships, or even accomplishments of some hero or character, they build tension that leads to conflict. And whether it's a moral conflict or a physical sort of a battle that takes place on the material plane, we find that even the tone of this poem, that is narrative poem, creates an impact on the reader. So the tone of the voice is located as the speaker of the poem, whether a character within the poem or as somebody that is the omniscient narrator or an observer. Now, when we locate the speaker, we also focus on its tone. For example, the tone might be harsh, it might be full of scorn and anger, it might be filled with embitterment, it might be filled with pessimism, optimism, or happiness too. Now, this tone also helps us find out what the speaker is like, how does he feel, what type of personality he has got. And this knowledge of the plot and the situation within the poem and the knowledge of the speaker's tone and voice would reveal further aspects about the creation of an understanding as well as the message or theme of the poem. Now that we know that poems also make use of three types of narrators. The first person narrator, who is the character within the poem, as it happens in mostly dramatic monologues. The third person narrator, that is the character seen through the eye of the observer or the poet. That is the case mostly in narrative poems like epics and ballads. And then an omniscient narrator, who is an all-knowing figure who is describing the events either about somebody else or about his own life. Now, if these are the three instances in which we locate the speaker or we identify the speaker or the voice in poetry, let us observe or identify these voices or speakers in these examples. Now, look at this first example that will help you in understanding the speaker or locating the voice within the poem. Now, it requires that you pay attention to the conversation, the dialogue, or the description that occurs in a poem. This extract is taken from Edgar Allan Poe's poem, who describes the story of Annabel Lee, and Annabel Lee is also the title of the poem. In his poem, he tells us the story through the first person narrator. Now, this first person narrator is a character within the poem who is the participant of the story or the action within the poem. Ultimately, we find that he lies down at the tomb of the lost love, and he mourns or he recollects what he had been through with her in the past. Now, I've chosen just the beginning of the poem to give you an idea that how we say that this poem makes use of the first person narrative point of view, or the first person's voice is used over here. How do we say that? Why do we say that? Read the poems a few lines carefully. The title of the poem is Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. Now, observe this first stanza of the poem Annabel Lee. The first few lines, rather first 5 lines of the poem, give a very descriptive and sort of an objective view that it was many and many years ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. So it's like a storyteller's technique of including us as well within the poem. That we may say that the speaker, initially we would say that the poet is telling us that he is describing about a girl whom we may also know, and her name was Annabel Lee. But when we read the next line, this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. Now, when the word me occurs, we recognize that this is the speaker. Who that me is, he may not have been named in the poem, but it's a very personal account by a speaker or a character created by the poet within the poem. That is why we usually avoid using the word poet when telling or describing or commenting and analyzing about a poem. We do not usually say the poet says that. Why? Because it might not always be the poet himself going through that experience, but just like a storyteller or a novelist, poets also create situations in poems. They may not tell everything objectively about themselves or more personal accounts of their lives, but they even create stories, events, incidents, and even characters within their poems. So here, when we read this line that this maiden, she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. Now, who that me is? That me is the speaker of the poem, the voice of the poem, that is the first person narrative account narrated by a character who has undergone the experience, and he's telling us about his life, and in this particular case he's telling us about his maiden, that a woman that he loved, and that is how we locate that this is the speaker in the poem, a character in the poem who is recounting his past memories. And we do not say that it's the poet Edgar Allan Poe telling us about his life, because we give a sort of an image of an impersonality to the author or the poet, because a writer's skill lies in separating himself from the text and creating something for the reader to experience as a distinct, unique, and separate from his personality. So that is why we say that this me is the speaker of the poem. This me is the persona of the poem. So that is why how the confusion of the poet and persona can be resolved. That though the poet has written the poem, but keep it in mind that a poet is fabricating a situation. He is not all the time telling us about what happened in his life. So this woman may not be the one about whom Ellen Poe is telling us as his personal experience. Here, he created a persona, he created a speaker, he created a narrative voice. And that narrative voice or speaker is a character who is telling us about his life or his love and his past. So that is why we say that he is the participant as well as the narrator of the action and happenings within the poem. So this was the example of the first person narrative within the poem, that is the speaker or the persona, that is a character within a poem. And most importantly, it's not the poet. We cannot directly associate it with poet. Now, let us observe another example of the narrative voice in poetry. And this example is taken from an anonymous poet's work, that is title is John Henry. Now it's a folk ballad, as I gave you the example of narrative poetry in the beginning, that ballads are sort of poems which narrate the accounts and incidents of the life of the common people, usually the country folk. The peasants usually, they are not noble or very grand dignified people. So the poem is titled as John Henry, written by an anonymous poet, and this poem relates the story of a man who conquers a steam drill but is dying in this process. And the third person narrator in this poem is used, and he has little insight into the characters, and it makes it an objective speaker. Now here, this example is that of an objective speaker who is the third person narrator and who has little insight into the feelings of the characters. Now, the poem begins, when John Henry was a little tiny baby. Now, look that this line conveys to us that John Henry himself is not telling us the tale. So, in this poem, had it been, when I, John Henry, was a little tiny baby, then it would have become a personal account or the direct speaker who is the character. Now, somebody who knows John Henry is telling us about him. So, here the speaker is the observer who knows this person, and he is describing him objectively. When John Henry was a little tiny baby, sitting on his mama's knee, he picked up a hammer and a little piece of steel, saying, "Hammer is going to be the death of me. Lord, Lord, hammer is going to be the death of me." Now, these lines reveal that John Henry has been observed by the speaker, and the speaker is neither the poet nor a character within the story, but somebody who is omniscient, who is outside the story or the poem. And he narrates to us what John Henry was like. What was his life like? And he is telling us the account in the direct speech as well, quoting the conversation or the speeches of John Henry, as he had one day said, "Hammer is going to be the death of me. Lord, Lord, hammer is going to be the death of me." Now, in these lines, we find that this speaker has the knowledge of a character named John Henry. Now, John Henry directly doesn't address the audience or the readers, or we as the readers are not being addressed by him directly, but an unidentified omniscient narrator tells the tale of John Henry in third person, as he is referred to as he. Whereas in the last example, where we identified it to be the first person narrative in the poem, there we found the me or the I within the poem. When the me and I are found within the poem, we located it with or associated it as the first person narrative. Now, when the poem John Henry addresses John Henry as he, then we identify it as an all-knowing, omniscient narrator telling us about that third person who is John Henry. Now, after observing these two examples, let us look at the third one, which would clarify to you the differences, and you will understand that how the first person and third person are to be differentiated even in poetry. In William Blake's poetry, we find strong narrative voice. For example, in one of his poems, Chimney Sweeper, it is contrasting a sing-song rhyme scheme and the grim and the very sad story of a small boy is told, that boy who is forced to sweep the chimneys. And we find in the rhyming couplet that it enforces the youth or the longing and the suffering, and the first person words build even the horror. The directness of the first person narrative account build the horror because of its immediacy, because of its directness to the reader as a person experiencing the horror, loneliness and labor in childhood is giving the account himself. Observe this example, that is the Chimney Sweeper. When my mother died, I was very young. That is by William Blake. The poet says that when my mother died, I was very young. Now, here William Blake has created the account from the perspective, voice, point of view of the character, that is a young boy who is a chimney sweeper. Now, the poet is not the chimney sweeper. The poet is telling us about an account of a chimney sweeper, that is a young boy. When my mother died, I was very young. Now, that identity of a character within the story is very evident from the very word I, the first person pronoun. When my mother died, I was very young, and my father sold me while yet my tongue could scarcely cry. Weep, 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 weep. So your chimneys I sweep, and in soot I sleep. Now the little boy's account is being told by he himself. Now the writer doesn't say that when the young boy's mother died, he was, sold to those who let children sweep the chimneys. It would have become a third person narrative in the poem. Rather, the poet makes the character or the child, the chimney sweeper, speak directly to the reader. He makes it in this way that when my mother died, it is the account by the chimney sweeper. He is addressing directly to the reader. So that is why we say that it is the first person narrative within the poem. So we locate the persona within the poem, we locate the voice within the poem, and say that it is a chimney sweeper's account. A little young boy who is a chimney sweeper is telling his tale, or he is describing his experiences. He says there is little Tom Dark who cried when his head that curled like a lamb's back was shaved. So I said, hush Tom, never mind it. For when your head is bare, you know that the soot cannot spoil your white hair. So that experience of even interacting with other boys is narrated as the poet has created a character who narrates the incidents about his own life as well as those of the others around him. So it becomes more like a drama, more like a situation in a play or in a novel where the writer has detached himself from the character, and the character comes to life more forcefully by this direct narrative voice, as an indirect account wouldn't have seemed so much effective. It wouldn't have really affected us emotionally. Now that we know that the character himself is telling us about his longings, his sufferings, or his hardships as a young boy forced into the job of chimney sweeping, and telling us how they were, their heads were shaven, and they were removed from their mothers and their parents, and they were put into the work that was too difficult for them to do. We recognize its horrors more fully. Had it been narrated by some outsider, we would have looked at it from that distance. Now the distance is covered because the voice comes from the very child who has experienced that. So the poet has minimized the distance between the experience and its observation by removing his personality or somebody else's personality who could have reported the events to the reader. Here we find a character who has experienced something. He is directly narrating those experiences to the reader. So this is the effectiveness of the direct narrative or the first person narrative account in poetry, that we find it to be more authentic, believable, real, true, and emotionally it is more effective. As you see that we find that there is no gap between the reader and the character who is defined in the account or in the poem. Now we have had a look at 3 examples to understand the first person narrative account and also the third person narrative account. Now, keeping in mind the various types of poems, for example, if we looked at epic and the ballad as such narrative poems which make use of the third person narrative, where the poet creates a character whose account is told in the third person. For example, it is referred to as he undergoing the experiences. For example, in Beowulf, we see that the creator of the epic has created the character Beowulf, about whom he tells us. Now, there is another instance of poems that we refer to as dramatic monologues. Now, a kind of poem that is dramatic monologue, it has got more room for building a character within a poem. So it complicates the matters more for the reader, as the reader who is a more a layman or not really aware of the types of voices or speakers that may exist in poetry may not be able to understand or grasp what is happening within the poem, because mostly the laymen or the novices are inclined to associate the descriptions and the characters in the poem with the poet. Now we, as the learners of stylistics, as well as the ones who are understanding the point of view and voice in poetry, have come to know the fact that we have to separate the personality of the poet from that of the characters and speakers within the poem. Then only we'll be able to look at it from the perspective of some person who has details and knowledge of the experiences. Now, in the dramatic monologue, as the very title of this type of poem suggests, there is situation, there is a particular setting, time within the poem. And since it's a monologue, there is a single speaker in the poem. We do not get to know about the account of many people, as it is dramatic, having a situation, a setting, a place, and characters as well. But from among those characters, only a single character speaks. That is why we call it a monologue. Dramatic monologue is a poem that we also know as persona poems. Why do we know it as persona poems? Because the writer creates a persona, a personality, a speaker or a character. So if you are ever told about persona poems, you must remember that dramatic monologues are also referred to as persona poems, because in the dramatic monologues we have a character, a speaker or a persona, a single speaker who speaks or tells a story, but there is presence of other characters too within the story. But about those characters we are told by that persona, because he is narrating all the incidents from his perspective or his point of view. So we see that the dramatic monologue shares many characteristics with the theatrical monologues, and in which we have an implied audience within the poem. There is no dialogue, no exchange of conversation as would be between two people in a play or in a novel. And in the dramatic monologue, the poet speaks through an assumed voice. That is a fictional character given an identity within the story of the poem, or more specifically, we call him a persona. In dramatic monologue, we find the speech of a single person. We find the conversation taking place that is coming from the single point of view or perspective, that is of that persona or the speaker or the character. It is offered without any overt analysis. Overt analysis because it will be a one-sided view. It will be a biased view. It will be a story from the angle of a single person. Now the reader is to look at it objectively, that how far the account is true, balanced or unbiased. But we say that it is not told explicitly, it is told overtly. Overtly means that there might be ironies, there might be instances where we may find it unbelievable because we do not know the other angle or side of the story, because everything is being told from one person who might be the culprit himself but posing to be innocent. So it is offered without any overt analysis or commentary, and it places emphasis on subjective qualities and that are left to the audience to interpret. Now, one of the very great strengths of a dramatic monologue is that it leaves a lot of room for the reader to judge the persona, to judge the speaker, because the speaker is telling us about the incident from a single perspective or angle, as if he is defending himself. We as readers are given a lot of room to explore, investigate and find out how much truth is there in the account, how much discrepancy is there, and looking at his details that the speaker gives to us, we may objectively look at what are the details which the speaker might have hidden from us. Now that is the very strength or quality of the dramatic poem. This is what gives it more flavor, and that is what adds more interest to the reader. That a dramatic monologue, since the account comes from one of the characters who had been involved in a situation, but the account given to the reader is from the perspective of that single speaker who tells us what others behaved like or what others did. But we as a kind of judge or observer are in a position to see how much of the account is true, how much is a kind of fabrication. So this is where the dramatic monologues become more interesting, because the speaker is the character who dominates the thought, the incidents, and who dominates the even thoughts of the reader as well. Dramatic monologues, though, are very much older a version of poetry. They were there in the medieval age as well, and they were there in the Anglo-Saxon poetry as well. But the more distinctive recognition that they received was felt during the Victorian era, when Robert Browning made use of the dramatic monologues with so much perfection that even in the modernist poetry of T.S. Eliot and some other poets like Ezra Pound, and even later poets like Mr. Philip Larkin and such other modern poets, has been perfected and been used by them in the contemporary poetry too. Now, the dramatic monologue as a poetic achievement got its distinctive place in the Victorian poetry by Robert Browning. Most of the poems of Browning, like My Last Duchess, and also his poems like Porphyria's Lover and the Soliloquy of the Spanish Cloister, are considered to be for the Victorian readers the very distinctive poems which create a character and dramatize a situation. Now these have become a model of the dramatic form of poetry for the readers. Now the monologues of Robert Browning combine the element of speaker and the audience so deftly, so aptly, that the readers seem to have some control over how much the speaker will divulge in his monologue. And this complex relationship of the speaker and the implied listener within the poem. Now, one listener is the reader. One listener is the audience that is outside the poem, that is we. But another listener is the implied listener within the dramatic monologue, whom the speaker or the persona within the dramatic monologue is narrating the story, incident or events. Now this forms a very complex relationship between the speaker within the poem and the audience within the poem. Now this complex relationship is evident in one of the very famous poems of Robert Browning, that is My Last Duchess. Let us observe this extract in My Last Duchess to analyze the relationship of the speaker and the listener or implied listener within the poem, and then look at the role of the reader too, that how a reader is to look at and judge the speaker, how the reader is to look at the speaker and then identify the audience in the poem or the listener, that is the implied listener. Why implied? Because that listener that exists within the poem whom the speaker in the poem is addressing is not given a voice. That is why we say that he is implied. We suppose that this account is being told to an audience or a person within the poem who is not given any voice. The voice is given only to one speaker who narrates the account, who is the persona or the major character telling about an incident or event. Observe this poem, My Last Duchess, by Robert Browning. He says, that's the very start of the poem, that's my last duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder now. Fra Pendorf hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? I said, Fra Pendorf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured continents, the depth and passion of its earnest glance, but to myself they turned, since none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you. But I, and seemed as they would ask me, if they durst, how much a glance came there. So, not the first are you to turn and ask thus, sir? It wasn't her husband's presence only called that spot of joy into the Duchess's cheeks, perhaps. Now, in the reading of the poem, you might have observed that the poem begins by making the reader acknowledge the fact that the account is directly being told by a character or a persona who is addressing some guest. As he says, pointing to a portrait, the speaker says, that is my last duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. I call that piece a wonder. Now Fra Pendorf's hands worked busily a day, and there she stands. Will it please you sit and look at her? Now, this part, will it please you sit and look at her? Now, this command, that is in the form of a question, makes us aware of the presence of another character within the story or within the poem who is being addressed by the speaker or the persona. Now, it is the Duke or the king that is identified as the husband of the Duchess, and the Duchess is not there because the Duchess's portrait is being shown to a guest, another person, an outsider. Now that guest or outsider is being addressed in the poem in the form of certain questions and commands and details that are being given to him, but that implied listener is not given a voice. He doesn't speak. That is why we call it dramatic monologue, not a dramatic poem. Why? Because in dramatic poem there could have been many voices within the poem. Since it is a monologue, we know that there would be a single person, the very persona or the speaker, as the main character would be addressing or speaking to an implied listener who is there within the action but who is not allowed to speak. Now, when we read that, will it please you sit and look at her, we find that the Duke is giving a command, is asking somebody to do as he likes. And then when says, I said, Fra Pendorf by design, for never read strangers like you that pictured continents. So, the guest is the stranger, and the Fra Pendorf is another person about whom the speaker, the Duke, tells us about. Now that Fra Pendorf is the painter, the one who painted the picture of the Duchess. His name is Fra Pendorf, but the man whom everything is being told is a stranger. Maybe he is the one who is for the first time visited the Duke's palace, and he is being shown the portrait of his last Duchess. And then another person about whom we are told is the Duchess herself. Now, the character who is speaking to us, who is the persona, who is the narrative voice, who is the giving point of view, is the Duke. And through the Duke, how many people do we get to know in this dramatic monologue? We get to know about the stranger, the visitor, whom everything is being told. We get to know about the Duchess, who is the last Duchess. And later on, we will get to know by the reading of the poem that she is dead. She is no more. Now, look at this situation in the poem, that how like a drama, how like a novel or a fiction or a story, does it create room for characters, building of situation, even of themes and incidents, as you know, sort of interestingly, as would be done in a short story or a novel. Now, those of you who had been given an impression that poems are always associated with the poet, the poet is saying that, would have been given this understanding that how wrong we are in assuming that everything directly comes from the poet. The poet is not always part of the poem or the incident narrated in the poem. Rather, the poet, like a novelist or a dramatist, has this much skill or potential, or even that much room within the confines of the poetry, that he can create characters, he can detach himself from something that he wants to convey to the reader, and it might not always be he who is delineating an account of his life. So this misconception about the understanding or that poetry is always about the poet's own experiences would have been clarified now when we understand that there occurs or there exists a narrative voice not only in the novels and fiction like short stories, but also in poetry. So whose story, whose account, whose feelings, emotions are delineated? Not always the poet, but most of the time, the poets create characters, the poets create speakers, the poets create a persona. Either that persona gives details objectively as an observer, or he gives details personally as a character, like in the Last Duchess. So observe this poem and keep reading. You will find many, instances or many evidences of the fact that how much you can, look for the interest, surprise, and features like the existence of multiple characters, but viewed only from a single person's eye. That is the speaker in the poem. That is the Duke in the poem. And he tells us that he was the husband of that Duchess, whose portrait he asked to be painted by the friar or Fra Pendolf, that is the friar or the priest. And then a stranger, a neighboring country's imagery or ambassador, is here, whom he is revealing this story, to whom he is revealing the details. He's telling what type of a woman his wife was, as he says that she used to smile for everybody. She and her husband's presence was not the only reason for her smiles. So it shows his sort of psychological sort of possessive mind as well, that he doesn't want the Duchess to smile for others, and he is quite angry that the smile on her face might also come from the joy that she would have on meeting others. So he has shown his psyche too, since the account is that of the Duke himself. So the Duke exposes his possessiveness, or his sort of you can say cruelty too, that he was not very much appreciative of the Duchess' generosity and her manners that she had been showing towards the strangers too. So the speaker, though, is telling us about his Duchess, or is telling us about how the portrait was painted, and is telling us also whom he is telling the story to. ironically exposes himself as well. We see the Duke in a better light. Now, this is where, in the dramatic monologue, the identity of the speaker or the persona leads the reader to judge the persona from a very impersonal and bias-free angle. We see that though the account told by the persona or the speaker in the dramatic monologue comes directly from a character, but what flaws are there? What is there that is lacking? Because he is revealing his desires, his feelings, his emotions, as well as he is revealing the state of mind, which might be quite ironic too. When he's telling that he controlled everything, he tells us about his, possessiveness, maybe his sort of psychopathic disorders, which he is the victim of, and also his cruelty, his atrocity, or maybe the fact that he might have murdered the Duchess too. Now look at how the identity or identification of a speaker might reveal those concepts or ideas which the poet hasn't explicitly exposed. That is why we say that when we try to locate and find out the speaker within the poem, the voice within the poem, we also begin to analyze the psychological dimensions of the story or tale. Now, the psychological dimension of this story or tale, narrated by the Duke in the poem My Last Duchess, reveals a lot about the atrocity, the tyranny, and the psychological state of mind of the very Duke. So, look how the speaker, who is just a voice, which we earlier had been used to of associating with the author or the poet himself, has revealed different angles and perspectives through which a poem can be analyzed, how it even relates us in identifying the themes of the poem too. So that is how we locate a speaker within a poem. That is how we identify which particular angle the story has been told to the reader. Either it is a character created by the author, there is a fictional or assumed character, a persona or a speaker who is a participant of the event and observer at the same time. Then in the poetry, that is the third person account reveals that some all-knowing or omniscient narrator has observed some character and he tells us about him, the way it was the case in the poem The Chimney Sweeper by William Blake. So these two poems, William Blake's Chimney Sweeper gave the account of third person narrative in a poem, and My Last Duchess gives the account of the first person narrative in the poem. So this is how we see the persona, the speaker, the voice, the point of view, or the narrative perspective in poetry. Thank you.